and in a way at least as harsh as in South Africa under apartheid, discriminated against, and they worked for very low wages under very harsh conditions on plantations. So there was hardly any difference for them. So once the cities in the north of America started to industrialize, they all moved there. So, and this was even during the Second World War, when all these industrial cities started to produce airplanes, weapons, etc., it created another wave of black exodus from the south to the north. So the exodus from the south to the north was a very important shared history of the people of the black communities in the American cities. Another more recent history is in 1967 in Detroit. This was not the first riot. It was the biggest riot, but there had been riots in 43, in 44, there had been riots in the 19th century. Rioting was not a completely unexpected event. Rioting was part of the history, was part of the living memory of most of the rioters, or at least of their fathers. Rioting, but rioting in a different sense. The rioting until 67 was usually the rioting of two groups against each other. So for example, the Irish started to fight the blacks, or the Italians started fighting the Irish, and then the Italians and the Irish started fighting the blacks together. And then the police came in, and the police always joined the Irish, because police are usually Irish. So, but it was a different kind of rioting. It was the kind of rioting that you see in Gangs of New York, the famous Scorsese movie. The rioting, so this was the memory of rioting. The memory of rioting was the blacks fighting another group, and the police always choosing the side of the other group, the whites. So when in 67 the riots happened, the new thing was not the riot itself, but the new thing was the absolute absence of the whites, except being shopkeepers with a gun, but only a few of them, and the white police. In 67, the riots were more or less against the absence of the whites, you could say. And one of the living memories of the riots of the 40s in Detroit was that there were areas that were literally, in a way that reminds you of current Palestine, literally warded off from each other with huge concrete walls dividing black neighborhoods from rich white suburbs. So these things were, so the city itself already had showed the traces of the riots before. So riots were already part of the background. Also in England, rioting was not new. There were race riots in the 50s in Notting Hill. There were riots in the 60s, etc. Again, but these a little bit like the American earlier riots, where there was rioting between the white inhabitants and the black inhabitants, with the police nearly systematically choosing the side of the white ones. Here you see a British newspaper headline from the 50s, for example. And in Los Angeles, the same thing. In Los Angeles when in 1992, Los Angeles, the riots happened, it was a kind of a déjà vu, or reawakening of one of the second biggest riot of the 60s. The biggest was Detroit. The second biggest was 2 years earlier, the famous Watts riots in 1965. And this is interesting because the Watts riots in 1965 were a kind of high point of black emancipation. It was very difficult there. I mean, even if you would be very conservative, very law-abiding, it was very difficult now, or it is very difficult now, to not see the riots of 1965, the Watts riots of 1965, as a righteous riot, meaning a riot that you can understand, that that you choose the side of the rioters, because the Watts riots were in one of the what was then one of the most racist cities in the USA, was literally an insurrection against this racism, against the constant beating down by the police, etc. And also the riots of 1965 gave rise to a whole generation of black politicians, black culture, etc. A whole a generation also of white politicians that promised to do better. So you could say that the riots of 1965 were understood as being a kind of righteous insurrection, which also took place in a very simple way, a little bit like Detroit, purely in a pure black neighborhood, fighting the police on the edges of their neighborhood. And so it was contained, it was ideologically clear, etc., and it created a whole generation of heroes. France had not so much a particular... In France there were two things. What happened is when the riots happened in 2005 in France, people said, oh my God, there's rioting in the suburbs. Oh my God, they're burning cars. The truth actually was that since the 80s, there was nearly permanent troubles in the banlieue of France, but then incidentally, always a little bit. But there was in 91 there was a little bit of a wave. In the 80s there was a bit of a wave. In Toulouse in the late 90s there was a big riot in 98. So they were never gone. They were never not there, the riots in the French suburbs. And also an interesting statistic is that at the point that Chirac says, okay, normality is back, it meant that there were not like 800 cars being burnt every evening, but just 30, which is the normal kind of